Welcome to Master of Science with host Professor James McCanney. The good professor's career spans 50 years as a university teacher, scientist, and engineer. Each week, he will explore the rapidly changing world of science as many long-held theories are crumbling under the weight of new data. He will cover the fields of geology, archaeology, meteorology, oceanography, space science, astronomy, cosmology, biological evolution, virology, energy, mathematics, and more. So please welcome the host of Master of Science, James McCanney.
Good evening, everybody. And tonight, a very special show. I have a guest, and typically, up until now, on this show, I have not had guests, but I'm going to start to do that more often. And I couldn't think of a better guest to have tonight as a first-time guest on this show, as Mark Gaffney. Now, I can't remember where I met Mark. He might remember, or how long ago it was, but it was certainly decades. And so I've known him for a long time, and we'll talk about his background. But we just celebrated something called Earth Day. Mark was the founder of Earth Day. He's got some very interesting books. I'm going to hold one up here. This is what we're going to be talking about tonight. This book here, Deep History and the Ages of Man. It's the second edition. And Mark H. Gaffney. And it's about pole shifts, something I've been talking about recently in my show. So anyway, let's bring in Mark. Mark, how are you doing?
Very, very happy to be with you, Jim.
Yeah.
Professor.
And so tell us a little bit about Earth Day, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I was a principal organizer of Earth Day in 1970 at my alma mater, Colorado State. So that was my contribution.
Right. Yeah. So
we had some interesting events that year. I had been to the first Earth Day at Ann Arbor. I flew out there for that, and then came back and organized one at Colorado State. They had that event back in January, and we, of course, it became a annual April event after that.
Right. So also, I just want to read off some titles of your other books here. The Dimona, the Third Temple, 1989. Gnostic Secrets of the Nicenes, 2004. The 9/11 Mystery Plane and the Vanishing of America in 2008. Black 9/11 in 2012. And then a novel, Never Summer, in 2017. Those are listed in the front of your current book, which I will point out again is let me see if I can get this centered here. I'm having a hard time getting the camera. There we go. Deep History and the Ages of Man. And so anyway, our current topic here is dealing with pole shifts. Now, it's something that I've talked about for a long time from the physical aspect, that the only way the Earth can have a pole shift is if some external agent comes along and does something drastic, and these are typically gravitational, not magnetic. The Earth has magnetic pole shifts maybe 2 times a month. Where the solar wind comes out, it has the pole reversed from the normal North Pole. It switches Earth's magnetic field, and we don't have pole shifts. Physical pole shifts. It's just a magnetic pole shift. So there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of misconceptions revolving around that. But what Mark has done is he's gone back and looked at other factors that are affected by pole shifts. And this is where literally the pole of the Earth, if you took the globe out of the rack that it's in, and there's the North Pole and the South Pole pin, those change. In other words, the entire mantle and crust of the Earth rotate over the central core. And so we get a complete shifting of the pole. And then therefore the ice caps melt very rapidly. That's one of the effects. But it has a drastic effect on the flora and fauna. And this is where Mark comes in. So Mark, people hear me talk all the time, so I'm going to let you do the majority of the talking here. So go ahead for that little introduction. Go ahead.
Well, let me start at the beginning. One of the first things I discovered was the evidence that had been in the hands of Charles Darwin in the 1840s about that was, you know, I mean, it just jumped off the page when I first saw it. I guess I was primed for it, you know. But Darwin never put it together. He had the evidence right in front of him, but didn't draw the correct conclusions from it. And that is the fact that these mollusk species along the coast of South America had moved north to return to their. They were trying to get back to their proper temperature, their preferred sea temperature, you know, the water temperature. There are a couple of sites
I'm just going
down
to
in
interject something by moving. In other words, you see the fossilized remains in one place, and where they're living today is in another place. Is that
exactly
correct?
right. And this data, he produced this in a table in his book on the geology of South America, which is a large, a thick tome, you know. But I had decided to start talking about my book, talking about Darwin, because um, his he came really close to explaining evolution, but fell short. And he spent a lot of time down in South America and made a lot of trips inland, you know, and had found a lot of evidence for cataclysmic changes in the past. But he backed away from this in his Origins of Species. And wanted to find out why. And the reason, of course, was because he became so closely associated with Lyell's work. And he was so influenced by Lyell's book on geology, the principles of geology, that he used that as a template for his own research and copied that style of writing in uh, his famous book about evolution.
Okay, so yeah, so Darwin had the data, and like a lot of times I saw this in astronomy when I was at Cornell. The data's coming in, it's saying one thing, it's just staring you right in the face, and everybody's saying the other thing. And it's because it's a dogma. It's like they can't overpower that almost like a religious sect mentality. And so Darwin had the data. Talk a little bit about Hapgood.
Well, yeah, I mean, Hapgood was a visionary thinker and was able to get outside of his own head, outside of his own examine assumptions, figure out what were hidden assumptions and limiting thoughts, limiting beliefs, and and take it to the next level. And we're still struggling with. He's still considered pseudoscience today because by mainstream because they are trapped, they're prisoners of their own limiting beliefs and hidden assumptions about the pole positions. They assume that these pole positions are written in stone and they're unchangeable. And that's simply not the case.
And this is a top-down thing. I was just reading a little bit in your book about this, but this is so characteristic of the sciences where the geologists depend on another group, and et cetera. But it all comes back up to astronomy, which is what I found out. And the astronomers are saying, okay, the solar system began 4.5 billion years ago, and really these planets have not interacted since. And then the universe began 13.5 billion years ago, and all this stuff is flying apart, and so nothing has ever interacted again. And so, for example, they're finding thousands of new planets outside the solar system. They're immediately going, oh, well, these all formed when the solar system formed. And without, I saw an example the other day where they were drilling on Mars, and they say, we're drilling into this ancient bedrock before they ever drilled into it. It's that mentality, and it's really top down from astronomy, who says that the Earth, whatever it did, had to do it all by itself. And so anyway, that was Hapgood's situation. That was Velikovsky's situation. But go into a little detail, Mark, about Hapgood's theoretical work and what he projected.
Well, let me just jump from Darwin to Hapgood. When I was in South America, one of the things that just struck me immediately were the terracing system around Lake Titicaca and in the Sacred Valley. You have this ancient agricultural system that was created in stair-step terraces up the mountainsides, and they grew their food there, and it must have that the area supported a much larger population than at present. But those terraces are not being used today because the whole Andes was lifted up several thousand feet, and they can't grow corn there anymore, so the terraces are not even being used. Now, Darwin never made it up to the Titicaca. He never made it to Cusco, and if he had seen this ancient system of agriculture, I think he would have realized that he knew that the Andes had been lifted up by as much as 8,000 feet. But I don't think he realized that that a large part of this, and I think he knew that the most recent rise was between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. But he was thinking in terms of long spans of time. But this was recent. This change happened recently, and because those terraces were created, they were not created a million years ago. This was a terracing system that had been in use tens of thousands of years ago, probably.
Now, here's something, excuse me, that I've noticed about geologists or meteorologists, or you take almost any other field. The people in these fields have very poor physics backgrounds. Now, to understand what it takes to take something the size of the Andes mountain and plateau and raise it 8,000 feet, this is not an afternoon project. This is not something that, and so they talk about plate tectonics and they have these nice pictures in textbooks of the plates moving and then subducting one under the other. But where is the Herculean force, number one, that makes the plates move sideways? And second of all, if they did, to raise that amount of land and rock that high there's no way to do it. There's no physical way to do this. Yet you'll see these drawings in textbooks, etc. And so the only way you can have something like this happen, including a pole shift, is for the crust and the mantle to be jarred with a gravitational wave from outside, which means something the size of a planetary size coming by. And in one afternoon, this happened. This was not millions of years of slow migration. This happened in an afternoon. That's how long it took that planet to fly by.
Well, when Darwin was in South America, he saw an earthquake. He lived through a couple of earthquakes, and also there was a huge volcano that erupted when he was down there. So he concluded that the uplift was caused by these forces within the Earth. Again, he's thinking within the Earth, Jim.
Right.
But
right. Go ahead.
Yeah, and we have a 2,000-mile displacement of the crust, accompanied by an uplift of the Andes of probably 2,000 to 3,000 feet up. I can't imagine how an earthquake could do that, or a volcano, either one.
Right, but the other thing that you're talking about, we'll get into this, is the species, because this happened quickly, and you can see it in the geological record of the fossil record, and that's where your work comes in to identify that what Darwin should have seen and identified, what countless other people should have identified, and but anyway, that it happened quickly.
Well, I think it must have. I think it did. Yeah. Originally, Hapgood was unclear about this. He thought maybe it happened slowly, over a period of a few years or
Right.
or many months. But I think he threw that out. In the end, he was indeterminate. He couldn't decide, so he left that open. But I think
which is
as we go on, it's becoming more and more clear this was a sudden event.
right, right. And there again, he should have done that. He should have left it as an open question because he didn't have the information to really make that decision. But what happens, and I've noticed this, the first thing geologists do, archaeologists, anthropologists, is they put a date on something. And they have no real information to do that. So or they talk about the length of time it took to, say, move the mountains or build the Andes or whatever. They don't, instead of saying, I don't know, they put some kind of number on it and it's incorrect. And then they got to run with that.
Yeah, then they end up defending it, and trying to defend it.
Right, right, exactly. And so Hapgood, basically, what was his data? What was he looking at?
Well, he had geological data. I'm not, I've been mystified by how he figured it out. I mean, he was really close, with identifying the last pole position in Hudson Bay. He was really close,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just amazed that he got so close based on the data he had, because we have an easier time today.
Right, right. Well, there's a couple things that point towards somewhere in that location. One of them is the Laurentian ice cap, which was the old North Pole. The only part of the current North Pole complex is Greenland that was in the old one. And so you had most of North America covered down to Missouri with ice, out to Oregon, where you are, east to the Connecticut or something like that, but nothing in Siberia. And so
Exactly.
when that shift occurred, all of a sudden you have the mastodons, and this is where a lot of geological data comes in. You have now what is Siberia, which is in frozen tundra north of the Arctic Circle, with frozen temperate climate mastodons, frozen standing up, flash frozen. You have, all of these other factors, and like what you're talking about, the mollusks, etc. Um, Talk a little bit.
Yeah, well,
I talked
let me
about.
just expand on that for a moment, Jim.
Yeah.
Let me expand
Oh,
on
go
that.
ahead. Yeah.
Uh, on a just a hunch, I did some Google searches and came within minutes was looking at studies by these mollusk experts, malacologists, I think they're called, and of a similar event that happened on the coast of North America, on the West Coast. You had species that formerly lived in California, and they had migrated 750 some miles up to Puget Sound to get back to colder water because the
They're very
temperature of
temperature
the
sensitive.
yeah, they were temperature sensitive, and these mollusks are I mean, these guys are they are experts at location experts,
Sure.
geolocation. So they had relocated. Well, these scientists didn't even know about Darwin's data, and they were unaware that a similar thing had happened up the coast of South America. Well, if you have this event taking place along the coast of North America and the coast of South America, that's a global event. That's not, and they've been trying to explain this with regional or local explanations, like the uprising of cold water, of changes in currents
Right.
or other
The earth did it
factors.
all by itself, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, they can't. None of the explanations can explain it. So this was a
If
global event.
right, right, and that's the other thing. It wasn't just the mollusks on the west coast of California. This was a global event. Another indicator is that when you have a pole shift, um, the maximum pole shift is in one location, and then there's 2 points at which there is literally no change. And in between those locations, you have the maximum change, and then you have the minimum change. And so you can almost pinpoint where the old axis was by looking at that data, actual uh, uh, data of mollusks and other fossil records.
And that explains why the mollusks migrated, moved. It's not they don't swim, but their larvae can move. They ride the currents. And they moved 1,600 miles north up the South American coast, and the change, the movement of the mollusks up the coast, the west coast of North America, was only about 750 miles because it had to do with the distance between their breeding grounds on the habitat and the meridian of maximum displacement. So if
Right,
as you get closer to the meridian, the distance would be greater. It would be closer to the movement of the crust, which is in this case, it was about 2,100 miles.
right, right. And so there are points at which the movement is very minimal, and then there's other places like you say, 2,100 miles.
Yeah, the movement along the coast of North America was much less because it was further away from the meridian.
Right, right. And so anyway, you put all this together, and other people have come up with the idea of like Velikovsky, who was once again ostracized to the nth degree. And when Sagan did away with Velikovsky, he had geologists come in, and they were adamant that the Earth had to have done all this by themselves, and they were old school geologists. I met some of them when I was at Cornell. He put together this team of people, and what Velikovsky was saying was that the ancients talked about a large comet doing this. You find the Mayans talking about Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent god of the night sky, whose heart became the planet Venus, talking about this large comet that was Venus, the protoplanet Venus comet, that came by Earth two times and the second time caused this tremendous amount of damage. They talk about the tidal waves carrying the ocean on its back, all of these figurative forms of saying that they're talking about tidal waves. And they talked about the death and destruction, etc. But anyway, so there's all of this data, and you have an adamant, cloistered group of people in geology, anthropology, and now there are people coming along and saying, "Oh, an asteroid hit Earth and did this." Asteroid collisions do not explain this kind of worldwide event, and if it was that major, you would have a hole in the Earth the size of the Atlantic Ocean.
This was an encounter with a large celestial body, not an impact.
Not an impact, because you would see the impact. I mean, where's the crater? Or multiple impacts or whatever.
Well, I also discussed in the book the early in the period of science at the time of Newton, his colleagues William Whiston and Edmund Halley, all of them believed that comets had caused the Great Flood, the biblical flood, and they believed that comets could do this. Somehow this has gone out of science. I don't understand why.
Yeah, well, I did a calculation when the comet Hale-Bopp was here, and I looked at the size of its tail. If Earth would have crossed through the tail of Hale-Bopp, we would have had about 12 days of torrential rain. So a big comet, Earth passing through the tail of 40 days and 40 nights is not out of the question, because Hale-Bopp was not a big comet. And so the other aspect of that is that they had warning. Noah had time to build the ark. Uh,
So there would have been tremendous flooding, but it wouldn't have been enough to flood the whole Earth. That would have been caused by the gravitational pull, I suppose, Jim,
well,
on the water, on the oceans.
there was torrential rain, and that would have been enough potentially to raise the ocean levels hundreds of feet. I think that there are cities, ancient cities, that are out there on that continental shelf that drops off like all around like the eastern coast of the United States or out in the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America right now. Um, but I think that if you went out at the edge where those drop off, you would find major cities, archaeological cities underwater that were prior to the Great Flood.
Well, we know that there are ruins off the coast of India. I mean, Graham Hancock visited those, and I'm sure you're right, Jim. The deep sea, the deep ocean, and off these continental shelves is still largely unexplored, as far as I know.
There's when I was coming back in 2015. 2015. I was in Peru, and I was at Nazca. I was at Cusco and Machu Picchu and Lake Titicaca, and I came back up the coastal road, and there's a it's like an ancient city there, and there's outcroppings all along the coast there, but it was one continuous city as far as I can tell, with an estimate of about 40 million people that would have been living there at some time. But there's nothing left. There's not a potsherd, there's not a bone, there's nothing, which would tell me that a big wave came in and just washed it clean. Uh, but you find these all over the world, and I don't think it was one event. And that's, I think, a big mistake a lot of people are making. You mentioned Graham Hancock. They're trying to put everything into one event at the end of the Younger Dryas, like 12,000 years ago. And I think that there are
He's
many,
limiting himself to talking about just the most recent event.
yeah, or one of the most recent. And there again, I don't put dates on things because if you look around the world, potentially there were many events, and we're seeing the results of many of these disastrous events. Some of them worse than others, and so and there again, they don't have a cause for what they're seeing. For example, they're talking about some of the cities. They say, "Oh, the people covered them with dirt and then left," and I find that hard to believe. Like Gobekli Tepe, they're talking about the local population covered the entire city and
Oh, yeah.
then,
They say it was intentionally buried.
and I'm like,
Intentionally buried.
that. I mean, that first of all, it's a lot of work, and to move that much land and then to cover a city. But the obvious answer to me is that over time, or a big tidal wave came in and just washed the material in and dumped it there. That would make more sense to me. And we don't have a date. We don't have a time frame. All we know is that it's much more ancient than, say, Egypt. The artifacts you see in Egypt.
Yeah. I was going to ask you a question
Sure.
about the differential effects of a passing comet on the Earth, gravitational effects. You think that could cause the folding of the uplift of the of mountains, the
Oh,
differential effect
absolutely,
of the gravity? Is that what
absolutely.
does it?
And oh yeah, and so imagine the tidal wave in the ocean when we rotate under the moon. It can be as much as say 15 feet or more, and that's water. At the same time, the Earth's crust is raising maybe a half inch, and that's just us turning under the moon. That wave, because we're moving, the surface of the Earth is moving at 1,000 miles an hour at the equator. That wave is literally moving at 1,000 miles an hour. Now bring something by. There's factors are the velocity. If it's coming much faster, the wave has much more impulsive force. So if it's coming faster, if it's coming closer, if it's bigger. If you got something much bigger coming by much closer, much faster, all of a sudden you have the potential for 1,000-foot land wave. So you have this wave literally in the land, and that comes along and hits. First of all, the ocean comes up and just a huge tidal wave. That's then that land wave, when it hits some impediment, like a wave hitting existing mountain ranges, all that energy goes into that mountain range, and that's where you get the uplift. And so we're talking about massive forces here. There are Indian tribes in the American Southwest who claim that they lived through, or their ancestors lived through, mountain building of that type, where it happened like overnight.
Well, I think of that petroglyph at Green River, Utah, that you mentioned in one of your books that I looked at very carefully, showing the sunward spikes on two of these comets, or in fact, not one comet, but two comets in that uh,
Right.
petroglyph, showing the sunward spikes, which have never been seen by the unaided eye in modern times, must
There's the book.
indicate, yeah, there are the spikes on the tips there, but it must indicate that these comets were very large and were very close to Earth
Yeah,
for that to be viewable.
that's right. Another thing I want to point out here on this one, this is the cover of my book, Planet X Comets and Earth Changes. The one over here, let me see. Oops, let me get my finger there. Here, this one. There, this one here. Um, you can see the nucleus. Now, a comet tail is about 100,000 miles in diameter, so this would have been something the size of Jupiter. And so there are things out there that are that big. And they're definitely on the track of finding these now with actual telescope discoveries using big
Do you think,
telescopes.
in other words, well, let me just clarify this. Are you saying that you think there are comets the size of Jupiter?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And they, when they come through the solar system, this book, in fact, this is where I talk about a lot of the effects. Um, but uh, I call it action at a distance. So there are electrical effects, magnetic effects. There are activity where the sun uh, has tremendous activity going on. And then if they come close enough to Earth, and this is something, they don't always come close to Earth. So it's a relatively rare event. But there have been 20 mass extinctions in Earth's history that we know about. These are major mass extinctions where the atmosphere changed. You know, when the dinosaurs were here, we had a very different atmosphere. It was very high in carbon dioxide. The plant growth was abundant. There's not a single place on planet Earth today that would support dinosaurs with the amount of foliage you'd have to grow to support a dinosaur, or a herd of dinosaurs, or groups of dinosaurs. And where do you find dinosaur bones? They're out in Wyoming. There's not enough plant life to support a herd of cows, hardly.
Well, and we have these, think about it, these vast coal deposits that
Right,
have to be the residue or the residual biomass from all this green material, this growing material that was rolled up and just deposited together in these specific places, that happened as a result of these kind of events.
right. It's not from fern forests where the plant matter fell and then rotted. Right here, I just happen to have a piece of coal. Let me see if I can get it in the camera. But anyway, the you can see this is a piece of coal from a coal train. You can see the leaves, the fern leaves that are embedded in that. They're fossilized. There was no time to rot, so they're just piled up, huge piles of this, and the pressure squeezes the water out, and you're left with coal, the pure carbon. Uh, and
So each
so,
one of these coal deposits is a record of a huge event that happened at some point.
absolutely, absolutely, and the idea that this was fern forests that, once again, they have to explain them by using, though the Earth did this all by itself over millions of years. And no, this was done overnight. This was deposited overnight. And a big wave came in. Where did the big wave come from? A large passing comet nucleus.
Well, what do you think? what do you think the resistance is in the science community to even contemplating this kind of mechanism?
Um,
You'd think they would be on top of this.
well, here is what I've figured out over the years, and I thought too that eventually they would wake up and figure this out. And what I've discovered is that I've divided science into different tier levels: tier one, tier two, tier three levels of science. And tier one science, they're very aware of all of this and very cognizant. But those people don't publish in peer reviewed journals, they don't work in universities, they work in private think tanks that are um, basically answering to the World Bank, who funds them, who controls the governments of the world, etc. What we see is tier two science. So when you talk about university professors or geologists that publish in peer-reviewed journals, etc., that's tier two science, and it's allowed to be. It's fostered because of the funding, the way the top-down funding works. These people, their funding depends on this. They cannot get outside of this box, or they lose their funding, they lose their tenure, they lose whatever, and they know it. So they don't say anything. And if they don't know it, either they don't know it and they keep getting their funding, or if some of them wake up someday, they never say it. They will never ever go against the apple cart because they know their funding depends on it. And that's the situation today. It has been that way. I taught astronomy in 1990, about two. I taught university level astronomy. The textbooks are the same today as they were then. You know, that's 30 to 40 years of no change. Impossible.
Yeah, I don't think it would have been possible for me to produce this book if I had been a PhD level student or even a master's level student in some university, and this would have been my my thesis or dissertation. I don't think it would have been allowed. Probably they
No,
probably would have
no, absolutely
shepherded
not.
me away from that.
You would have been sidelined, and it would have been homogenized and blended to the point where you wouldn't be able to recognize it. Um, I wanted, Mark, also for you to talk about the bone caves.
Oh yeah, let's do that. Yeah, this was amazing work, and I got to give credit to the paleontologists that did this over what almost 200 years. And these caves began to be explored in the 1820s in England. And the first one that came to light was Kirkdale Cave, where they found a mix of bones of different species that some were from the boreal north and others were from uh, a subtropical climate. And it was a huge riddle because they seemed to be mixed up together at that point. How do you explain this? It took quite a while for the science community to figure this out, but uh, you had hippos that were thriving in the Thames River and in central England where Kirkdale Cave is located, also in Europe, and you had a subtropical climate. Well, it just so happens that this is the deepest layer of five. We now know thanks to the work by this guy named Jacobi and the other one, what was his name? Roger Jacobi and Andrew Current and Roger Jacobi. And I consider this paper so important that I got permission to reprint it as an appendix to my book.
Hmm.
Because these guys, they kind of summed up all the work that had been done over 200 years in this paper. And it turns out there were not one layer, there were 5 stratigraphic layers that came to be identified. And every
Hmm.
one of these layers, the deepest was the hippo layer, and then there was a layer where the species in England were the mammalian assemblage was temperate climate-oriented species. And then there was another layer, a third layer above that, where you had boreal species from an ice age. And then there was above that another temperate layer, and then the modern current fifth layer that corresponded with the present pole position. It turns out each one of these layers correlates with the climate, correlates with each one of the pole positions that we now understand, we now are aware of, thanks to the work by Carlotto, who was studying archaeological sites, and he used archaeological sites to pinpoint 4 previous pole positions, and they correlate climatically with these layers in these caves in England. So it's really a holographic record of the planet over
So
130,000 years. Pretty
right,
mind-boggling concept.
right, and so yeah, so we have we don't know. Let's put a number here: 150,000 years, where there maybe within that period of time there were 5 pole shifts, but we don't know. I feign to put
Well,
numbers
assuming
on
that
any.
assuming that the isotopic dating is, in principle correct,
Hmm.
they have dated fossils from each one of those layers.
Oh, okay.
So
And
that
what were the
puts us in the ballpark, on the age.
and what are those?
Uh, well, I have to go through the book. I don't keep
Sure, you're
facts,
like me.
on the
You
tip
don't
of my
remember the
tongue, but
numbers. Yeah,
we
but
have the most recent at Hudson Bay. We're talking about anywhere from 20 to 30, 40,000 years. And then the previous, that was those species would be temperate species. The ice age came before. This is a European ice age, came before that, where the pole position was off the coast of Norway. And we have dating there in the 70,000 years before present to 80,000. And then you have a pole position at North Greenland, dated to 90 to 100,000 years ago. And then the last, most oldest, deepest layer corresponding with the subtropical climate in England, where you have the hippos, dating to 121,000.
so these are big shifts. This is not like a couple degrees.
Well, yeah, we're talking 30 degrees of latitude change, from in the movement of the crust. So,
Right, and that's 90 miles per degree, and so yeah, we're talking, thousands of miles that
the last
that
one,
the shift.
2,100 miles about.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so um, what I want to do now is talk in general about pole shifts because this is something that it got some traction, but really bad traction back in the Planet X days, the early 2000s. Velikovsky talks about it. Hapgood talks about it. Darwin should have talked about it. But uh, it's something that is so essential to understanding the history of man and Earth, and these events that really shaped. Um, and I don't like the word evolution, but the constant change, the demise of entire species. Uh, and so it's such an essential aspect, and it's something that's just completely obfuscated from people don't talk about it. It's not something that is allowed and like you say, they talk about pseudoscience and Hapgood also. What's his name? Lieutenant Governor Minnesota, the uh, in the 1800s. What was his name? He wrote the book.
Oh, he wrote the book. Yeah, I have his book on the shelf behind me, but I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But
I'll
yeah.
think of it in a minute. But those were naturalists. They talked about the condition of the prairies when the first settlers came
Ignatius
across.
Donnelly.
Ignatius
Ignatius
Donnelly.
Donnelly.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the first one was Atlantis, the antediluvian world.
right. And he goes through, when they were the first people to see the North American continent, and they said it was covered with residue of floods and washes and disaster. And the story is that by the end of the 1800s, all of that had been eliminated because people used it for firewood. They completely changed the face of the North American continent by human activity. And so after that, then people came along and said, yeah, there wasn't any such thing. And they call Ignatius Donnelly a quack. And so, but the reality is, you have to look at those people, and they really were right on about what they were talking about. And
Well,
the
we know where the evidence is, Jim. This kind of evidence still exists on the planet, fortunately.
right,
And one place that you can find it is off the coast of northern coast of Siberia. There is a submerged forest up there, the remains of a tremendous forest that covered much of Siberia before the last event. And the science is going to have a very difficult time explaining how a forest came to be north of the tundra.
right, right. Or how there, for example, oil. The one of the myths of oil is that it came from decaying fern forests. Well, large deposits of oil are in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or in the Gulf of America and all over in underwater places. Where were the fern forests that caused those oil deposits? Nothing makes sense. But I think what we're I think what we're going to find is if science is defunded, this is a big issue. I think there's going to be some major changes because people will be freed up from this funding issue that keeps science locked into these mantras.
Well, how could that come about? I mean, it's hard to imagine how that could change.
Right, right.
How do
Well,
we bring that about?
yeah, it's difficult. It's really difficult. But I think also the more people hear this, they go, "Yeah, this makes sense." And people are, because let's face it, government is funding science. So it's government funded science, and um, that's what keeps science in power. If they increase the funding for science, the same people get it, and it just keeps them more entrenched than ever. And if and I deal with peer-reviewed journals more and more these days, and I have peer-reviewed journal articles, but it's just a constant battle against people who the thing they have to always do is say that the earth did this by itself, or the sun or the solar system did all this by itself. And so I think if we keep moving this, today is a little different because look, I have this television show, and I'm every week I talk about some of the novel ideas in standard science that just cannot possibly be true, but it's something you're taught from the time, in a subtle way, from the time you get into kindergarten. And so,
Well, in my book, Jim, I identify a number of tests that could be done to confirm Hapgood's theory. Where could we go to do this? Well, off the north coast of Siberia is one place you could find the evidence right there. Also, Svalbard, I believe the oceans around Svalbard, we will find the deposits of these temperate species of mollusks that require temperate water temperatures, not frigid, temperate.
mhm,
And
right,
that would be further evidence right there. You can mount an
right,
expedition and find it. If you just we could probably do it.
right, right. And then by identifying the movement of different species, maybe identify like you say, the meridian of maximum displacement and the minimums, and that would also give us a change. I myself, in the mid 1990s, went to Chichen Itza. I lived as a young guy in Mexico. I lived in Mexico City, and I did a lot of work, just field work in archaeology. I was like 22 years old. But I went back in the 1990s with surveying equipment. I went to Chichen Itza and Uxmal and Tulum, various other places, and realized that they were aligned with the old North Pole. So I came up with the conclusion, and really not thinking of Hapgood, that the old North Pole was in what I called north of the state of Michigan in Ontario. So I knew it was up there somewhere. And it turns out when you cross the lines from those surveys, they end up in Hudson Bay. So what they were doing is they were building the new cities on the old gridwork, not realizing that there had been a pole shift and not identifying that. So you find the modern cities, which we know that they rebuilt. And the reason they built them is because Venus didn't come by and destroy their city again. Because the Popol Vuh talks about Venus, the comet, coming by every 54 years with a close approach to Earth. But so anyway.
They were offering sacrificing hundreds of thousands of people a year down in Mexico City to propitiate, the destroyer god.
Right. And so we have
that
to
was
look
going
at
on right up until the time of Cortez.
Right. Yeah, and they picked that from the Mayas. It was like the Romans and the Greeks almost, the Mayans and the Aztecs. The Aztecs picked up a lot of what they had from the Mayans. They came later. And then there's those cultures we don't know anything about, the Toltecs, the Olmecs, prior cultures that were very advanced. The same thing in South America, Peru, etc. But I think we're running out of time here, Mark. Do you have any last comments? I want to show you a book again here.
I wanted to talk about Peru because of those Nazca lines. Some of the implications are pretty mind-boggling. Maybe we can get into that in another show.
Yeah. We'll do this again because there's so much to cover. But encourage people, your book is available on Amazon. It's called Deep History and the Ages of Man with Mark Gaffney, 2 F's, Gaffney. And yeah, Mark, we'll do this again. There's 1 hour is just not enough time to cover everything.
This has been Master of Science with host James McCanney. Join us each week as James will delve into historical figures such as Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, and the great mathematicians as we explore the history of man, Earth, and our universe as you've never seen it before. Tuesdays, 7 p.m. Eastern, right here on the Bold Brave TV network, powered by